obviously a great honor to introduce tonight Professor Noam Chomsky and to welcome Professor Chomsky and his wife Valeria to UMass. I'm sure all of you know a lot about Noam Chomsky already, otherwise you wouldn't be here, so I won't spend a lot of time reciting his amazing accomplishments in so many fields, both as a researcher and a scholar, somebody for the ages, somebody that will be talked about in hundreds of years, but also as a person who has demonstrated for over 50 years an unrelenting commitment to social, economic, and ecological justice. So that said, it is my great pleasure again to introduce Professor Noam Chomsky.
I've been intrigued for quite a few years by an interesting debate that took place about 20 years ago, I guess, between Carl Sagan, well-known astrophysicist, and Ernst Mayr, who was the grand old man of American biology. They were debating the likelihood that we could find extraterrestrial intelligence. And Sagan, arguing from the point of view of an astrophysicist, had calculated the number of planets roughly like ours, and concluded that it's highly probable that there is intelligent life out there. Mayr took a different stand. He was arguing from the point of view of a biologist, and he said, we have only one sample, Earth. There have been 50 billion species on Earth, and we have a good deal of evidence about what factors contribute to biological success and survival of the species. That survival means roughly how many of them are there around. And he says when we look, we discover that the species that are successful are either those that mutate very quickly, like bacteria, or the ones that just keep to a fixed niche, ecological niche, and never move, no matter what happens, like beetles. And as we move up the scale of what we call intelligence, success is less and less. By the time you get to primates, there are very few of them. In fact, up until recently, humans have been around for about 200,000 years. We're very scattered, just like higher apes. So humans in the last couple of hundred years are sort of statistical blip, which doesn't change the pattern. So he concludes, Mayr concludes, that the history of life on Earth refutes the claim that it's better to be smart than to be stupid. He also adds that the average lifespan of a species is about 100,000 years. Modern humans, are about 200,000 years. So we're in a good position to test the thesis. The Indian writer, Amitav Ghosh, just came out with a book called The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable. And his point is that our failure to deal with the most awesome challenge in human history, with the possible exception of nuclear weapons, is indeed a true derangement and rather painful evidence for Ernst Mayr's thesis, unfortunately. As we all should be well aware, these are the two existential challenges that overshadow everything else. Their severity and their imminence is illustrated graphically by the famous doomsday clock of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. Every year, a group of consider the state of the world and set the time, the minute hand on the doomsday clock, asking how close it is to midnight. The midnight means we've proven Meyer's thesis. It's better to be stupid than smart. The doomsday clock was established at the beginning of the nuclear age. The first year was 1947. At that point, it was set at 7 minutes to midnight. In 1953, the United States and Russia detonated hydrogen bombs, and the minute hand moved to 2 minutes to midnight. It's oscillated since. In the years 2015 and 2016, it was moved forward to 3 minutes to midnight. That's as high as it had been since the early 1980s, when there was indeed a major war scare. The reasons for moving it forward the last couple of years were the mounting threat of nuclear war and the failure to deal with climate change, which had not been calculated into the analysis before that. And here's what the statement said. The statement said the probability of global catastrophe is very high, and the actions needed to reduce the risks of disaster must be taken very soon. That was 2016. A couple of months ago, at the outset of the Trump term, the analysts moved it again. They found, in their words, the danger to be even greater, the need for action more urgent. It is 2.5 minutes to midnight. The clock is ticking. Global danger looms. That's the closest it's been to terminal disaster since 1953, when, as I mentioned, the two superpowers tested H-bombs, which can destroy human life instantaneously. Well, actually, that earlier brush with disaster, 1953, terminal disaster, merits more attention than it's received. There is an obvious question about it. Was it avoidable? And what efforts were made to avoid it? There's an answer to that question, and it's quite startling and fraught with grim lessons for today. Let's go back to 1950. The United States was remarkably secure, unbelievably so. It controlled the entire hemisphere, controlled both oceans, it controlled the opposite sides of both oceans. It had overwhelming economic, industrial, and military superiority. It largely controlled the major industrial states. Of course, every other major industrial society had been severely harmed, almost destroyed by the Second World War. The United States economy had in fact benefited greatly from the war. Industrial production practically quadrupled. The stage was set for the great economic expansion in the 50s and the 60s. Well, there was a potential threat to U.S. security. It didn't exist, but it was going to exist sooner or later. International continental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, which would of course have nuclear warheads. That would become a devastating threat to the United States. In fact, it was about the only security threat at the time. So how was it dealt with? Actually, there is an authoritative study of this by McGeorge Bundy, who was the National Security Advisor for Kennedy and Johnson administrations, and he was given access to the history of strategic weapons. He was given access to the highest level classified material. And if you read through the book, there's a kind of a casual statement about halfway through, which is one of the most remarkable statements I've ever read in the literature on international affairs and strategic issues. He says, I am aware of no serious contemporary proposal around 1950 in or out of government, that ballistic missiles should somehow be banned by agreement. Then he goes on to the next topic. So in other words, there was apparently no thought at all, in or out of government, of trying internal documents, classified documents, public ones, no thought of trying to avert the sole serious threat to the United States, the threat of utter destruction. And there's a lesson there. It means that for planners, the security of the population is a very marginal concern, even security from utter destruction. Rather, the institutional imperatives of state power prevail. There's lots of talk about security, but it doesn't mean your security. It means the security of power, corporate state power. That's also quite apart from the remarkable character of this discovery is the fact that there isn't any comment on it. Nobody seems to care. It's kind of obvious that why should the security of the population be of any concern to planners, even their survival. And it's not an isolated example by any means. So let's look a little further. Were there possibilities at the time for some kind of negotiation that could have averted the threat of instant destruction of the United States, the only security threat we faced? Well, we can't be sure, of course, because the apparent opportunities that existed were simply ignored. And there were possibilities. So, for example, in 1952, Joseph Stalin, still alive, made a pretty remarkable public offer. He offered to permit Germany to be unified on one condition, that it not join NATO, impossible military alliance, which is not terribly surprising given that Germany alone had just virtually wiped out Russia a few years ago, as it had during the First World War. He also mentioned the prospect of elections, which of course the communists would lose. This offer was known. It was discussed by one of the most prominent and respected political analysts, James Warburg, but he was simply ridiculed. How could it possibly be of any interest? And whenever the idea was mentioned in later years, it was simply dismissed with ridicule. Recently, the Russian archives have been opened, and it turns out that the offer might have been serious. The bitterly anti-communist Soviet scholar, Adam Ulam, Harvard, he takes the status of Stalin's proposal to be what he calls an unresolved mystery. Washington wasted little effort in flatly rejecting Moscow's initiative, he writes, on grounds that were embarrassingly unconvincing, leaving open the basic question: was Stalin genuinely ready to sacrifice the newly created German Democratic Republic, the Communist East Germany, on the altar of real democracy, with consequences for world peace and for American security that could have been enormous? One of the most prominent Cold War scholars, Melvin Leffler, writes now that scholars who have studied released Soviet archives were surprised to discover that Lavrenti Beria, the sinister, brutal head of the secret police, proposed that the Kremlin offer the West a deal on the unification and neutralization of Germany, agreeing to sacrifice the East German communist regime to reduce East-West tensions and improve internal political and economic conditions in Russia, opportunities that were squandered in favor of securing German participation in NATO. Those of you who are paying attention to current affairs can draw some conclusions. well, was the offer real? We can't be sure. What we can be sure of is that what mattered was global power, not security for the population, even security from instant destruction. And if you look over the long record, over and over, you find that this is one of the starkest and most consistent lessons of policy formation. A lot of talk of security. It's not security of the population, which is at most a marginal concern. It's much too large a topic to review in detail here, but I'd really urge you to look into it. It's quite illuminating. Let's just proceed a few more years into the 50s and 60s to see how these ideas play out. Stalin died a couple of years later, in 1953. After a little while, he was replaced by Nikita Khrushchev. And Khrushchev understood that the Soviet Union could not possibly compete with the United States economically or militarily. It was much too far less developed society and undergone horrifying near destruction during the Second World War, as several times before. He therefore made an offer to the United States that both sides should sharply cut back weapons, offensive weapons. And in fact, when the Kennedy administration came in, Khrushchev actually did so unilaterally, sharp cutback in offensive weapons, asking the United States to reciprocate. Well, here's what happened. I'll quote one of the most respected U.S. international relations scholars, Kenneth Waltz, died recently. Waltz writes that the Kennedy administration undertook the largest strategic and conventional peacetime military buildup the world has yet seen, even as Khrushchev was trying at once to carry through a major reduction in the conventional forces and to follow a strategy of minimum deterrence. And we did so, even though the balance of strategic weapons greatly favored the United States. Once again, the Kennedy decision harmed national security while enhancing state power. And if you notice some analogs today, you're not mistaken. Well, how serious the threat was in 1960 was soon revealed in October 1962. What Kennedy advisor, historian Arthur Schlesinger recalled the most dangerous moment in history, the Cuban Missile Crisis. And as the facts about that have come out over the years, the story is really harrowing. President Eisenhower, it turns out, had sub-delegated authority to use nuclear weapons to commanders. Dan Ellsberg, who was involved closely at the Rand Corporation in strategic planning at the time, has gone through all the documents, investigated on the field. Has a book coming out in which he describes in detail at how low a level it was possible for even crews to launch nuclear weapons. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, U.S. planes, B-52s with nuclear weapons, were flying constantly, the so-called Chrome Dome missions. The pilots have published memoirs. Turns out that individual bomber crews could have decided to launch nuclear weapons, ending human existence. And the details of that crisis merit really close consideration. They've been very extensively documented from the most credible sources. There was a possible resolution of the crisis, late October 1962. Khrushchev wrote a personal letter to Senator Kennedy, offering a way to settle the crisis at once. The Russians would withdraw the missiles from Cuba, and in return, the United States would withdraw missiles, Jupiter missiles, much more lethal missiles from Turkey. Well, it turns out that the missiles in Turkey were obsolete. A withdrawal order had already been given for them because they were being replaced by invulnerable, much more destructive Polaris submarines. So the question was, in Kennedy's mind, should we end the crisis by having Russia withdraw the missiles from Cuba while we withdraw missiles that we're already withdrawing because we're replacing them by more lethal ones? Kennedy refused. His own subjective probability, as he testified, was that the chance of nuclear war was between 1/3 and 1/2 if he refused, as he did. He had to establish a principle that we have the right to surround them with missiles. They don't have any reciprocal right. Again, the security of the population was a minor concern, and that continues right to the present moment, right at the Russian border today. And in fact, it's true of both of the two existential threats. There is an important difference between the two threats. If by some miracle we escape nuclear disaster, and incidentally a review of the record, which again I urge you to undertake, reveals that it is indeed a near miracle that we've escaped this far. But if we somehow escape, at least we know in principle, in the play, we can, in principle, eliminate nuclear weapons. And that's advocated by figures who are hardly doves, like Henry Kissinger and Reagan, Secretary of State George Shultz, the Senate's former leading specialist on nuclear weapons, Sam Nunn, William Perry, well-known former defense secretary, leading specialist on nuclear security. That's nuclear weapons. Global warming is different. It's inexorable. We might pass a point of no return soon, in fact, when the damage that we have done is uncontrollable. Well, looking over this situation, we see that the human species is now undertaking an experiment to answer Meyer's question. Is it better to be smart than stupid? And to examine the course of the experiment, let's just sample a few facts. So let me begin with a recent report last couple of weeks in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. This is the main source for high-level strategic analysis on these issues. There's a recent report in March on the vast nuclear modernization program that was initiated by one thread. Quote them. The current modernization programs include revolutionary new technologies that will vastly increase the targeting capability of the U.S. ballistic missile arsenal. This increase in capability is astonishing, boosting the overall killing power of existing U.S. ballistic missile forces by a factor of roughly 3, and it creates exactly what one would expect to see if a nuclear-armed state were planning to have the capacity to fight and win a nuclear war by disarming enemies with a surprise first strike. Russians, of course, know this very well, even without reading the article. Going on with the article, U.S. submarines now patrol with more than 3 times the number of warheads needed to destroy the entire fleet of Russian land-based missiles in their silos. U.S. submarine-based missiles can carry multiple warheads, so hundreds of others now in storage could be added to the submarine-based missile force, making it all the more lethal. All of this has revolutionary impact on military capabilities and important implications for global security. The implications, in fact, are very clear. Russian strategic analysts are, of course, aware that the United States, thanks to these modernization programs, now has the capacity to wipe out their deterrent in a first strike. NATO forces are carrying out provocative maneuvers right at the Russian border. In fact, both sides are carrying out provocative actions. The Russians do not have our sophisticated satellite-based advanced warning systems. They have limited information time if there's a possible attack. And with the Russian deterrent at serious risk because of the nuclear modernization programs, at a moment of crisis, and there are many possibilities, that Russian leaders might very well be tempted to undertake a preemptive strike just to have a chance for survival. And that's an act that would end organized human life on Earth. We know that. That's one of many examples of how close we are to answering Ernst Mayer's question. And again, it receives approximately zero attention outside of highly specialized circles. Well, once again, we can ask whether a diplomatic avenue is possible. It surely seems so. Is it being pursued? Not a slightest indication of it, or even discussion of it, exactly like the cases that I was discussing earlier, back to the beginning of the nuclear age. It's not the only case. Right now, if you turn on the television set, you see the frightening debates about the North Korean nuclear threat. North Korea may be poised to launch another nuclear weapon. The North Korean threat is regarded as one of the most severe in the world. And forceful measures are now being considered, in fact being prepared, that could have disastrous consequences. Well, again, is there a possible diplomatic path? Actually, China and North Korea have proposed a negotiated agreement. North Korea will place all nuclear weapons programs on hold, terminate them, and in return, the United States will end possible military maneuvers on the North Korean border, including flights by nuclear-capable B-52s. And North Koreans, of course, have memories of having had the country completely flattened by U.S. bombing 60 years ago. Well, is that option worth pursuing? Evidently not, for Washington at least. Any thought of exploration of that path has been forcefully rejected, again with scarcely a word of criticism. While the world is taking halting steps towards facing the existential challenge to survival, the U.S. virtually alone is racing towards destruction, and doing so with enthusiasm and dedication. Well, the oil industry, of course, has plenty of help coming from you. The International Monetary Fund reports that the fossil fuel industry managed to extract a $700 billion annual taxpayer subsidy. That's known as the free market here. And the industry doesn't take chances. In last year, 2016, it spent $117 million in campaign contributions while fielding 720 lobbyists in Washington to make sure that Congress gets the message. Better do what we want. And apparently, Congress does. There's a recent study in the Washington Post of Republicans in Congress, and it says many Republicans in Congress, contrary to what the leadership says, do recognize the severe threat of climate change, but they won't talk about it because of funding pressures from the fossil fuel industry. This is particularly true since the Citizens United ruling of the Supreme Court opened the doors even wider for a flood of corporate political funding, which means you toe the corporate line or you're out. Actually, these reports from the press are quite typical of the daily fare. I won't sample any more of them, but you can see them every time you open the press. 3 events took place last November 8th. One of them was very important. One was extremely important. And the third was utterly astonishing. The least of the 3, the least important, was the election in the United States. Plenty of publicity, important, but the least important of the 3. The more important, by far, of the 3 took place in Morocco, in Marrakesh, Morocco. About 200 nations were participating in a UN-sponsored international conference, COP22 it was called, which was an attempt to put some teeth in the Paris negotiations on climate change of the preceding year. It had been hoped in Paris that they could reach a verifiable treaty on actions to address climate change, but that couldn't be done because of a single barrier. It's called the Republican Party. The Republican Congress in the United States would not accept any verifiable agreement. So Paris negotiations ended with just verbal commitments. The Morocco conference was an attempt to go beyond that. And yes, again, it was moving in that direction. On November 8th, there was a report by the World Meteorological Organization, quoting it, it confirms that 2016 was the warmest year on record, a remarkable 1.1 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial period, sharply above the previous record set in 2015, approaching the desired upper limit set in Paris, goes on with other dire reports. That was November 8th. At that point, the deliberations ended. The electoral results came in from the United States, and the meeting shifted to another question. Can the world survive when the richest, most powerful country in world history with incomparable advantages not only is withdrawing from the effort to try to save the world from destruction, but is undertaking a dedicated commitment to race to the precipice as quickly as possible, which all brings us back to Ernst Mayer's question. Is it better to be smart than stupid? It's a question for you to ponder, like it or not, for you to answer, and without too much of a delay.
Few questions and answers. If people would like to line up in the front, we'll do this for maybe 15 or 20 minutes. Yeah, go ahead.
Hello, Dr. Chomsky. Just want to say that I love you and your work is immensely important to me and everybody here. There's no exaggeration. I cannot thank you enough for what you do. It really means the world to me. My question to you, given our unique situation in the present, in regard to the policymakers, the people that are actually corporations, people that are really making these decisions that are destroying our planet, is I'm curious what you think their plan is, knowing I'm sure that they know that the world is quickly coming to an end. What do they plan to do when there's no more people and there's no more plan? What are they going to do with all of their U.S. dollars and lack of workforce, and so to speak? What do you think?
So if you're Rex Tillerson, say, the head of ExxonMobil, biggest polluter in the world, and you know perfectly well, as a rational person, that you're destroying the environment for your children and grandchildren. So why do you continue? Well, it's actually there's a choice if you're a corporate executive. You can say, I'm going to work within the framework of this institution, or I'm going to get out and fight against the institutional structure of society. If you decide to work within the institutional framework, your choices are limited. If you're the head of, say, Ford Motor Company, and you decide to put aside resources to produce efficient mass transit in the future, which is what we need, you'll be out of business tomorrow, okay? That's the nature of the market system. You play the game or you're out. And unfortunately, that's a hard choice.
Thank you.